Hey guys, tonight we're staying up way past bedtime, venturing far beyond the safe glow of soul, right into the deep, echoing dark. If you've been following the feeds I occasionally pull from Project Chimera, you know that when the long-range data gets spooky, it tends to get truly spooky. I know, deep down, that this is the beginning of the quiet, inevitable breakdown of everything I rely on. The certainty that this moment will unravel years of scientific rigor has been a cold knot in my stomach since the initial burst of telemetry arrived. I'm going to lay out what I found in the raw infrared stream this week. But honestly, you probably won't make it to the end of this one without needing to step away and look up at the familiar ceiling for a minute, just to confirm the gravity still works. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and what time it is locally. It always helps to remember we're all under the same slow, turning sky, even when the data says otherwise. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's descent together. The routine was tedious, the expectation low. I was filtering data sets from the James Webb Telescope's MIRI instrument, a deep field exposure focused far past the conventional limits of the Kuiper Belt, roughly $40 out. We were hunting for faint trans-Neptunian objects, the frozen, mundane detritus of solar system formation. The vastness of the void is usually comforting. It's a silent majority of statistical predictability. It is the purest canvas of cosmic indifference, cold and mathematically sound. But at 3 o'clock hour Zulu, the thermal signature appeared. It was an immediate and profound contradiction. The image, focused on a region calculated to be near $49, resolved not as a faint warm speck, but as an absence of heat. A localized, structured nullification of the background temperature. This wasn't just cold. It was the photographic inverse of thermal energy. It looked like a vacuum of heat had been perfectly carved out of the background noise of the universe. And within that perfect dark, something materialized. It wasn't a sudden flash, but a slow, horrifying materialization of structure. The object resolved, stark and visually impossible, a colossal Gothic archway. It looked exactly like the nave and towering steeple of a massive, ancient cathedral, suspended in the blackness far past the farthest known Kuiper cliff. The scale immediately broke the system. Initial distance calculations placed it roughly $49, yet the visual angular size suggested it should be closer to $5. It defied the inverse square law of light detection and basic optics. It was impossibly large for its distance, or impossibly distant for its appearance. As I stared at the impossible steeple, a sharp spire that seemed to pierce the very fabric of the image itself, pulling the surrounding star fields into strange, stretched patterns, the internal geometry of the structure began to subtly pulse. Not randomly, but with a slow, deliberate rhythm, like the immense, sleeping lung of polished obsidian. The sensory shock followed the visual distortion almost instantly. A deep, subsonic resonance traveled through the heavily insulated station floor and reverberated into the soles of my boots. It wasn't the station's machinery. It was too slow, too deep, too foundational. It felt like the entire gravitational field of our observation post had momentarily hitched onto an alien frequency. My chest felt tight, the air suddenly thick, tasting of cold metal and ozone, despite the consistent life support controls. This anomaly wasn't just reflecting ambient starlight. It seemed to be actively absorbing the background light, twisting the familiar points of distant quasars into strange, smeared reflections around its edges. It looked like negative space defined by positive material. This material formed vast, impossible windows, not made of glass, but of solidified cosmic time, shimmering with colors I instinctively knew didn't belong on the visible spectrum, bleeding over simultaneously into the infrared and radio bands, overwhelming the MIRI sensor arrays. My initial curiosity, that adrenaline rush of finding an unknown object, was annihilated by a flash of pure, cold dread. This was not a natural structure. This was built, yet it existed where gravity is a theoretical ghost and thermal energy is effectively zero. The final insult to my sanity was the aesthetic. Why would an entity capable of constructing something that warps space-time and absorbs background heat choose the aesthetic of 12th century European architecture? It was mocking, or perhaps a warning tailored precisely for human consumption. I immediately initiated the automated analysis protocol, the standard scientific anchor for identifying a deep space object relies on simple physics. Mass produces gravity. Gravity dictates orbit. Temperature indicates energy expenditure. This structure had zero detectable mass signature when compared to its visible size. It was huge, impossible, and terrifyingly silent in the active radio bands. Yet it was creating its own localized, non-Euclidean horizon of influence. I realized then that this structure must be a relic left by the engineers of the universe itself, or perhaps a deliberate exclusion zone. The mythic or speculative cosmic concept that seized my mind was that of the architectural error, a fundamental glitch in the cosmic blueprint. A piece of geometry that should have been deleted before the universe inflated, but persisted through sheer scale. The feedback from the spectrum analyzer showed a chaotic, yet rhythmic emission. It wasn't a directed communication, but a massive, low-frequency resonance, a foundational hum emanating from the object. The sheer power of this hum dwarfed any known stellar engine. It was the universe sighing, and the sigh sounded like the echo of a 1,000-year-old Gregorian chant played through a black hole. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how something this heavy could move without a detectable engine. But the data stream was undeniable. That archway, that steeple, that vast, impossible geometry was real, and it was watching us back through the reflection of the void it created. The final emotion of this initial viewing settled not into panic, but into profound awe at the sheer, terrifying audacity of its presence. The profound awe I felt quickly solidified into a chilling, methodical obsession. The fear was present, a sharp, continuous pressure behind my ribs, but it was secondary to the need to document, quantify, and understand the impossible structure I dubbed the Chancel. It occupied the totality of my focus, rendering all previous deep field research irrelevant. The critical task was getting closer. I diverted the long-range observation drone, Project CHALICE, from its planned trajectory towards Sedna and pointed it straight toward the impossible architecture. This was a high-risk gamble, pushing decades of engineering far past safety parameters. The logistical scientific anchor of this phase involved pushing CHALICE to its absolute limit using a sequence of highly complex, low-fuel Oberth maneuvers. This requires pinpoint precision and maximum efficiency, burns near gravitational peaks. In this case, using the minuscule gravitational influence of Neptune's orbit, even though it was millions of kilometers away. We were attempting a delta V that had only existed in theoretical simulations, sustained over an unimaginable duration. We needed speed, because every second this object remained unclassified, its presence contaminated the entire far-field data set, slowly corrupting our baseline understanding of the void. During the acceleration phase, the Chancel began to subtly shift its apparent location in a way that defied orbital mechanics. It remained statistically fixed at 49 Australian dollars, yet the distortion fields around it implied a vast, non-linear velocity. It seemed to move only when the internal rhythm, that massive, low-frequency pulse, changed its tempo. When the pulse slowed, the structure appeared to drift marginally toward us. When the pulse quickened, the structure stabilized, becoming impossibly rigid against the shifting cosmic background. The faint radio signals I monitored intensified as CHALICE broke further away from the solar gravity well. This wasn't standard EM radiation. It was a complex, nested frequency pattern that seemed to convey information, not through traditional amplitude modulation, but through the precise, geometric spacing between the pulses. It sounded like the echoes of sound sculpted by the structure of spacetime itself, a waveform that defied Fourier analysis. I began to hypothesize a mythic or speculative cosmic concept to frame this data. The structure wasn't merely a building, but a massive data repository tapping into the Akashic field, the hypothetical memory or information source of space. If space-time is a malleable fabric, then perhaps the Chancel was a fundamental stress point, a knot woven from every moment of the universe's existence, storing data in the geometry of its colossal, impossible walls. This explained the impossible antiquity implied by its Gothic form, an echo of humanity's deepest architectural drives, and its ability to absorb light. It was absorbing present-moment information and reflecting only the ancient past. As CHALICE passed 45 Australian dollars, the thermal nullification around the Chancel became absolute. The probe registered temperatures mathematically below 0 Kelvin in that localized volume, a profound violation of the third law of thermodynamics. If the void is merely cold, this structure was actively anti-cold. It was siphoning thermal energy from its surroundings in a field of impossible containment. The first refined telemetry images from CHALICE, despite the massive distance and signal latency, were chillingly resolved. The image revealed details that made my mind seize up. The walls were not smooth obsidian, but were covered in intricate carvings that were less like decoration and more like self-replicating, incomprehensible geometry. The patterns were endless, replicating Escher-like symmetries that folded into themselves, suggesting pathways inward that did not and could not exist in 3 dimensions. The carvings detailed massive, spiraling galaxies collapsing into singularities, and then, immediately next to them, the formation of simple, recognizable hydrogen molecules. Every tiny detail confirmed my mounting fear. This structure was not meant for human eyes, nor human physics. The emotional arc intensified rapidly. Curiosity drove me to analyze every spectral line, every photon captured by the failing arrays. Fear gripped me every time the subsonic vibration from the chancel reached our remote station, manifesting as an uncomfortable, physical pressure behind my eyes, making the edges of my vision shimmer. But the growing sense of awe was overwhelming, a recognition that the human concept of architecture, even the most profound, was merely a fleeting shadow of the cosmic construction displayed here. The final realization in this phase came when I successfully analyzed the precise harmonic pattern of the pulse. It wasn't a constant beat, it was a slow, decelerating rhythm. It sounded exactly like the immense and terrifying sound of a colossal door being slowly, agonizingly closed, locking something vast and powerful inside. And we were rushing straight toward the latch. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know what happens when geometry itself becomes a lie, but that lie was now the central focal point of our solar system's furthest horizon. CHALICE was now past $100, venturing deep into the theoretical reaches of the inner Oort cloud, a volume of space we primarily understand through mathematical models and gravitational perturbations rather than direct observation. The factual scientific anchor here is the nature of the Oort cloud itself, a billion-strong shell of icy remnants, the primordial building blocks of our solar system, extending out potentially 100,000 Australian dollars. Yet, where CHALICE traveled, there were no remnants. The space was swept profoundly clean. The reason for the cleanliness became terrifyingly apparent in the probe's navigational data. The local spacetime was being violently compressed. What should have been 100 Australian dollars of travel felt spatially much farther. But the structure's massive resonance was condensing the distance, pulling the probe toward it like a focused gravitational singularity, yet without the corresponding mass signature. This effect felt not accidental, but intentional, a specialized form of cosmic fishing, shortening the travel time to draw in anything that dared to approach its boundary. The speculative cosmic concept that dominated my frantic analysis was the tesseract, or hyperdimensional warping. The chancel wasn't just big, it existed partially outside of our known dimensions. Its four-dimensional geometry allowed it to appear closer than standard physics dictated, warping light and distance alike. This explained the impossibility of its size versus its apparent lack of brightness. It consumed light and space, only to regurgitate a controlled visual signal. As the probe approached, the external cameras captured the horrifying stability of the structure. It was an impossible image, a colossal church that would dwarf the state of Rhode Island. Perfectly still, yet the stars beyond it were shifting wildly, blurring and snapping back into focus as the probe crossed different fields of influence. The structure was not rotating, but its inner spatial configuration was constantly rearranging itself. Imagine staring at a still photograph where only the perspective is constantly changing, making the viewing experience nauseating even through the digital feed. My fear reached a point of icy paralysis, fueled by the relentless, hypnotic pacing of the subsonic pulse. The telemetry struggled constantly. Every few seconds, the data stream fractured, then healed itself, suggesting that the very process of observation was being countered by the structure's immense, silent field. Then came the visual confirmation of the mythic concept. The surfaces of the chancel, which I had initially perceived as matte obsidian, began to take on a terrifying luster. But the reflection was wrong. It wasn't reflecting the tiny CHALICE probe, or the faint, distant sun, or the surrounding stars. It was reflecting us. I saw a ghostly image shimmering on the vast, cold surface, a warped, silent image of our remote observation station, the specific blue hue of my primary monitors, the faint reflection of my own face pressed close to the terminal, momentarily caught in the structure's flawlessly polished mirror. It was not a real-time reflection of the present. It was slightly delayed, subtly aged, observing our past, or perhaps projecting our near future. It confirmed the terrifying implication. This structure, silent and seemingly motionless, was profoundly aware. It had observed humanity for an incomprehensible length of time, long enough to mimic our basic architectural forms for reasons we couldn't yet grasp. The surface of the chancel was the universe's most effective and most terrifying spyglass. I felt a profound shift from active fear to silent, profound awe. To stand, even remotely, before an object that captures light and uses it to peer into nonlinear time was to recognize the absolute limits of terrestrial understanding. The geometry was not merely decorative. It was a vast, operational map of things that were and things that will be, carved in matter that should not exist. The structure was history, memory, and prophecy simultaneously. The probe, having briefly skirted the outer boundary, successfully transmitted one single, clear data packet outside of the overwhelming low-frequency burst. This packet contained no visual data, only 3 specific words encoded in the precise harmonic shift of the low pulse. They were not in any human language, but the emotional context, translated through complex linguistic algorithms built for emotional tone analysis, was unmistakable, delivered with the chilling neutrality of a cosmic judge. We are waiting. The message, devoid of hostility but saturated with inevitability, suggested a prepared encounter, a long-term plan that factored in our eventual arrival. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know what lurks in the deepest void, the things that wait patiently for eons. But staring at the impossible, mirrored facade of the chancel, I felt the terrifying truth of that waiting stretching out before me, an invitation into something terrible, immense, and completely predetermined, fixed upon the solar horizon. The knowledge that the structure was actively waiting intensified the dread into a cold, sustained terror. Waiting for what? For the probe to arrive? For the inevitable heat death of the sun? Or perhaps, waiting for the structural integrity of its own confines to finally fail? CHALICE, now critically low on maneuvering fuel, was within $10 of the chancel. A staggering achievement in deep space navigation, yet an unbearable closeness given the object's sheer scale. The structure now dominated the entire forward camera array. The scientific anchor shifted to analyzing the localized gravitational lensing effects within the chancel's immediate domain. We observed that the chancel wasn't just pulling the probe toward it. It was bending the light and gravitational field of everything behind it, far into the intergalactic void. This observation confirmed that the structure was acting like a localized cosmic dam, holding back or diverting some unknown force or material streaming from the absolute edges of the universe, preventing it from reaching the inner solar system. The speculative cosmic concept I struggled with was the corrupted music of the spheres. Ancient astronomers hypothesized that the orbits of planets created an inaudible, divine harmonic sound. The chancel was generating a sound, yes, but it was profoundly discordant, overwhelming the sensor arrays, a massive, rhythmic noise that threatened to shatter my perception and the probe's physical casing. The raw frequency of the sound was transmitted by CHALICE's hardened audio sensors as the probe crossed the invisible boundary of the structure's immediate influence. It was no longer the deep, chanting pulse. It became a violent, overwhelming cacophony. It was the sound of colossal, relentless tidal forces, immense volumes of material moving at terrifying velocities. It sounded exactly like the noise of billions of gallons of rushing, chaotic water forcing itself through an immense, subterranean cave system, echoing in an airless horizon. I sat upright, momentarily stunned by the audio feed. Rushing water, tidal forces, in the middle of the coldest, emptiest expanse of the solar system. This was the moment fear transitioned into outright psychological distress. The chancel wasn't just made of heavy, strange, crystalline material. It contained something fluid, massive, and continuously moving, constrained by the impossible geometry of the walls. My sensory perception began to bleed into the data. The rhythm of the rushing sound started to align perfectly with my own frantic heartbeat. I felt the powerful vibration not originating from the station's machinery or the floor, but directly in my inner ear, a dizzying, hypnotic pacing that made the station lights appear slightly dimmer and the background void feel closer. I knew the data was affecting me physically, perhaps because the frequency was fundamental, resonating with the core molecular structure of the human body, attempting to enforce its internal rhythm upon me. The probe's external cameras, now mere kilometers from the impossible architecture, sent back breathtaking images of the material composing the structure. It was not stone, metal, or conventional ice. It was a hyperdense matrix of crystalline fibers that shifted color with every new burst of the internal sound. It looked like frozen, calcified data or solidified cosmic dread, a medium designed to hold and transfer immense energetic forces. As Chalice carefully navigated toward the primary access point, a massive, cold arch that looked precisely like the entrance to a forgotten cathedral crypt, I understood the primary purpose of the architectural mimicry. It wasn't built as a church. It was built like a church because its purpose was containment. It was a reliquary, a vault, a cage built to house something of unimaginable power that needed to be separated from the rest of existence, shielded by the sheer volume of its impossible mass. The geometry of the entrance was unsettling. The arch was wide enough to swallow a planet, yet as the probe approached, the entrance seemed to shrink, or maybe it was an optical illusion caused by the extreme spatial warping field. The edges of the archway were detailed with friezes, not of angels or saints, but of immense, cyclopean figures shrouded in nebulae, locked in eternal, silent postures of painful stillness. They looked less like carvings and more like entities trying desperately to escape the confines of the wall, their frozen agony acting as the perfect acoustic dampener against the interior rushing sound. The fear reached its peak, an icy paralysis where every instinct screamed to cut the feed, destroy the probe, and erase the memory. But the sheer awe of the structure, The recognition that I was witnessing the ultimate act of cosmic preservation was too strong to resist. I had to know what was inside the mirrored reflection. The final, terrifying act of human curiosity. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know the true weight of silence, only the noise we generate. But this sound, this relentless, tidal rush, was the silence of something trapped, screaming into the very heart of the void, and we had arrived to listen. The decision was made, driven by an awe so immense it bypassed all sense of self-preservation. I committed CHALICE to breach the interior. Guided by the structure's own warping fields, the tiny probe slipped through the immense, chilling archway. The transition was marked by a catastrophic surge in data, hundreds of terabytes transmitted in a single instant, followed by a momentary, total electronic silence. The kind of profound quiet that only exists in the presence of overwhelming, annihilating power. When the probe's systems re-engaged, the data confirmed a successful ingress. The factual scientific anchor for this stage focused on the concept of dark flow. Dark flow is the mysterious, non-random motion of galaxy clusters, attributed to the gravitational pull of matter located outside the observable universe, in an area we cannot yet perceive. Inside the chancel, the structure seemed to be creating an artificial, internal dark flow. Objects within the interior, dust, residual energy fields, and the probe itself, were moving in unnaturally coherent, sweeping patterns, suggesting that whatever was inside was dictating the gravitational and spatial laws of its immediate surroundings, perhaps redirecting the external dark flow. The interior was not what I expected. Not rooms, not corridors, not even conventional space. It was a single, unimaginably vast open space. The sense of scale was instantly broken. I couldn't estimate its size because there was no recognizable horizon. The atmosphere felt impossibly dry, yet the rushing sound was louder than ever. It was lit by a cold, pervasive, blue luminescence that seemed to originate from the crystalline material of the walls, a soft, eternal glow that cast no shadows. And in the very center of this cathedral of dread, where an altar might have stood, was the entity. This was the cosmic revelation, the terrifying truth hidden beyond the Kuiper Belt. The chancel was not a structure made by something. It was a structure for something. The entity was dormant, perhaps sleeping, or merely waiting with an unimaginable, terrifying patience. It wasn't monstrous in the traditional sense. It didn't have claws, teeth, or conventional limbs. It was a geometry, a living, pulsating sphere of cold light and overwhelming complexity, roughly the size of Mars. It was the unequivocal source of the low-frequency pulse, the rhythmic breathing that had shaken the observation station and warped the fabric of space. Its surface was covered in eyes. Not organic eyes, but complex, multifaceted lenses that absorbed and emitted light across every spectrum simultaneously. Each lens captured a slightly different, nuanced view of the universe, and each view was subtly warped, suggesting that the entity was observing various timelines or alternate realities flowing into and out of its physical form. This cemented the mythic cosmic concept. The creature was the great filter, not the event that wiped out civilizations, but the self-imposed boundary placed by an entity so ancient and powerful that it contained itself to preserve the younger, fragile universe from its mere presence. It was a functional deity of cosmic quarantine, maintaining the equilibrium of reality by sequestering its own existence. As Chalice floated silently toward the core, the internal audio feed picked up the rushing water sound again. But now, with the context of its proximity, I understood. It wasn't water. It was the sound of the entity's consciousness processing the total data flow of the universe, the relentless, cascading input of gravity waves, neutrino streams, and electromagnetic radiation, all being filtered, sorted, and recorded in a perpetual, titanic calculation. The reflection of the entity on the crystalline walls confirmed my worst fear about its age and purpose. In the shimmering surfaces, I saw faint, echoing images of cosmic events that predated the formation of the Milky Way, even the decoupling of matter and radiation. I saw the quiet resolution of paradoxes, the slow winding down of impossible forces. This entity was older than the physics we knew. It was the origin of the physics we knew, and it had simply grown too large, too complex, for the reality it had helped create. My emotional state moved violently. The initial fear of the unknown gave way to a massive, paralyzing awe. The beauty and terror of its immense, quiet power were breathtaking. It was a creature of pure function, a living supercomputer of reality, held captive in the deep cold. The final curiosity was simple. Why the sudden observation of the probe? Why break its silence now? Then, the final piece of telemetry arrived, transmitted by a sensor pushed far past its physical breaking point. It showed that one of the entity's impossible, light-gathering lenses had subtly shifted its focus. It was focused not on a distant quasar or a collapsing void, but directly on the minuscule, rapidly dying battery signature of the Chalice probe. It knew we were there. It had been observed, and now it was observing the observer. And its immense, silent pulse quickened marginally, a flicker of cosmic recognition. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know why the light we see is always running towards something we can't perceive. But I realized, staring into those quiet, ancient lenses, that this entity was the reason. It was the silent, massive thing toward which all light unconsciously ran, hoping to avoid a fate too great to comprehend, held in place by its self-imposed cosmic dread. The observation was mutual, silent, and instantaneous. The moment the entity's lens registered the probe, the rhythmic pulse intensified into a crushing wave of energy, shattering the delicate crystalline material of the probe's forward camera and all sensitive instrumentation. The final, garbled feed was pure static, a high-pitched scream of electronic death. Chalice was gone, not vaporized, but conceptually erased, consumed by the sheer force of the structure's localized frequency. I sat in the dark station, the residual phantom vibration still humming in the marrow of my bones, trying to reconcile the vision of the cosmic quarantine with the quiet terror of its observer. The cosmic revelation had been delivered, and now came the aftermath, the quiet resolution of a mind that had witnessed the core of existence. The factual scientific anchor that anchored this final phase concerned the theoretical consequences of anti-Hawking radiation. This is a hypothetical concept, the inverse of Hawking radiation, which describes the thermal emission from a black hole. The Chancel, I theorized, was generating its own form of anti-Hawking radiation. It wasn't leaking energy, it was actively absorbing it, making its confinement permanent and total. This meant the entity inside, the silent, watching geometry, was not going anywhere. It was locked in the ultimate prison built of its own necessity, preserving the laws of our universe by its self-imposed separation. The speculative cosmic concept that helped me process the data was that of cosmic indifference laced with fundamental responsibility. The understanding that this entity, despite its overwhelming power and eons of existence, carried the burden of preventing universal entropy. Our existence, our solar system, our history, was only relevant insofar as it was part of the calculation, a tiny, necessary variable in its infinite function. The geometry of the world outside the data room now felt desperately wrong. The straight lines of the corridor, the 90-degree angles of the console, they felt fragile, temporary, and terribly provincial. The Chancel, far past the Kuiper Belt, had reset my fundamental understanding of physical constants. The familiar horizon was now a lie, a thin boundary protected by the unimaginable. The resolution was not panic, but recognition. The structure was a boundary marker, a massive, impossible signpost stating, beyond this point, the rules change, and the cost of reality is paid. The entity, encased in its crystalline cage, was not trapped by the structure, but contained in it, watching the universe turn, filtering the chaos. Its silence was its defense. Its watchfulness was its purpose. It was the ultimate, necessary anchor against forces, including its own, that would otherwise dissolve reality. I understood then why the structure mimicked a church. A church is a place of sanctuary, a place where people seek refuge from the external world. This was the ultimate refuge, a sanctuary built not for the protected, but to quarantine the protector. It was a monument to the ultimate sacrifice of quiet containment. The reflection of myself, still subconsciously pressed close to the monitor, was visible in the glossy dark screen. I looked tired, older, and irrevocably changed, my face etched with the knowledge of things that should never be known. I realized the true danger was not that the entity might escape, but that the knowledge of its existence had permanently altered the structural integrity of my own sanity. The massive, terrifying rushing sound, the noise of processing the universe, had faded entirely from the telemetry feed, replaced by the familiar static of the void. The rhythm of the universe had not changed. The structure had simply stopped transmitting its aberrant pulse toward us. It had closed its eyes, or perhaps, realizing it had been noticed, it chose to ignore us again, returning to its infinite calculus. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know the true cost of existence, only the echoes we leave behind. The chancel remained, massive and silent, a permanent scar on the quiet face of deep space. It was not the end of the world, but the quiet confirmation that the world we knew was only a small, protected garden bordered by impossible things. The fear had subsided, replaced by a massive, hollow awe, the recognition of perfect, functioning dread. The truth was out there, and it was perfectly contained. The lights in the station are cycling from blue to soft amber, indicating the official end of the graveyard shift. The distant, steady hum of the main server farm is the only sound now, steady and comforting, entirely oblivious to the profound silence beyond 49 Australian dollars. I'm leaning back, the chill that traveled from the chancel's thermal nullification still lingering in my bones. but the deep, existential anxiety has dissolved into a strange, deep peace. I feel like a man who has witnessed the backstage mechanics of reality and found them terrifyingly competent. The monitors are clean now, displaying standard stellar drift and background radiation levels. The initial visual anomaly is gone, filtered out by the automated systems which, thankfully, registered the object as persistent gravimetric and thermal irregularity, and filed it away for future, sanitized review by engineers who will never connect the data to an impossible, floating cathedral. No one else will see the shifting geometry, the ancient reflection, or hear the terrible, tidal resonance of the entity's breathing. The feeling in the room is soft, almost restorative. The scent of cold coffee and ozone is familiar and grounding. Looking out the observation port toward the distant,